Our sexuality is the foundation of who we are as human beings, and having confidence around that part of ourselves can affect our confidence in other areas of our lives. Carla Crivaro is a trauma-informed and certified sex, love, and relationship coach. She works internationally to help people understand themselves and each other, sexually and relationally. In sexuality, we can hold a lot of shame. This shame can make us shut down, close off, and not be open to the world around us, disconnecting and hiding. So being aware of where we hold the shame around our sexuality and no longer being triggered or afraid of experiencing it, and bringing that awareness, being able to fall in love with your own body, fully accepting that part of ourselves, enables us to have a lot of confidence in being intimate with others. All human beings want the same thing, a deeper connection. We just have all been conditioned very differently. We're triggered and react to different things, and most of the time it's actually nothing personal to do with you when your partner is triggered. It's probably something from the past. So how do we learn how to be vulnerable? Be clear on what we do and don't want, set firm boundaries, and share our thoughts and emotions from a place of self-responsibility, all whilst learning to love ourselves and appreciate just what we see in the mirror. Today's episode, I'm joined by Carla. How are you?
Hi, thank you, Natalia. I'm really well, thanks.
Good. So obviously today's episode, we're going to go down a little bit of a different path. And what we're going to talk about is, we're going to talk about, the human body, but in the sense of the outside, not inside. And we're going to obviously discuss things like, being confident and comfortable with yourself, and then how that can play out with things like sex. So the floor is over to you. So if you want to kind of tell everybody just a little bit about yourself and then why we are here today.
Hi, everyone. So my name's Carla Crivaro. I'm a trauma-informed and certified sex, love, and relationship coach. I work with men and women to help them understand themselves and each other, both sexually and relationally. And I wanted to talk today a little bit about sort of our sexuality and our bodies, and how really coming to love ourselves and, most importantly, love, our genitals can actually give us this huge sense of confidence in who we are as human beings. My experience has been, and, what I believe to be true is that our sexuality is at the very foundation of who we are as a human being. And what that means is that, having confidence around that part of ourselves can really affect our confidence in other areas of our lives as well. So, and, our sexuality is also where we hold a lot of shame. So having shame, what that can do to us is really make us go within, shut down, be closed, and not be open to the world around us. Especially when we're in shame, we tend to disconnect and want to, hide ourselves more, because we consider ourselves to be bad people. So that need to go within and disconnect. So being aware of where we hold shame around our sexuality and bringing that to the light, what that does is it helps us to integrate it and to no longer be sort of triggered or afraid of experiencing and being with that shame. It's not necessarily about getting rid of it, because shame is something that you will experience like any other emotion. It's just learning to be able to be comfortable and sit with it and notice how it's showing up. And notice that when you're feeling shame, what the stories are that are running through your head. So like the programming that you have connected to that emotion and a particular experience that you might be going through with regards to shame. And, the shame can come from our own expression of our sexuality. It can also come from shame around our bodies. And that shame can come quite a lot from the conditioning that we get as children. And it's not necessarily... It doesn't have to be sort of specific messages where someone's pointed at us and said, your genitals are dirty. It can just be the really sort of almost unnoticeable behaviors that adults might make, their own discomfort that they display around their own genitals, or by you touching your genitals as a child, because obviously children are curious, and, children get to particular ages where they start to explore their bodies. And how a parent can react to that. So even a look, how they might tense their body, just these very, very subtle messages we can receive as children, and we can internalize them as to mean that either we are bad or the way that we're touching ourselves is bad, or maybe our genitals are bad. So it's becoming aware of these messages that we might have. Like I said, they can be really subtle. It doesn't necessarily need to be something as, you know, profound and destructive as sexual trauma. It can be really, really sort of what might be seen as insignificant memories. And the thing is, it might not necessarily be a cognitive memory, but your body remembers it. Your body remembers that look and, you know, has completely internalized it. So bringing awareness to where and how we feel shame, how we might disconnect in relationship to other people, especially around our sexuality, can really help us to work through it, to heal that part of ourselves, and then give ourselves this sort of sense of power and inner confidence. Because as I said, if you're allowing the shame to sort of determine how you behave and how you act, then what you're in essence doing is allowing yourself to stay in shutdown. Whereas if you bring awareness and you notice that behavior, you notice that feeling, you can choose then to do something different, to behave differently. You can choose not to follow that script or that programming that you've, you know, had for years. So really being able to notice it, make a choice, and then choose to do something differently. And that's sort of the process and the way that I like to work and support people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of people, especially as they do get older, they have this shame, and you know they really struggle when it does come to being intimate with somebody else. But it's one of those kind of subjects where, well, who do they tell? Who do they talk to? And I think a lot of people won't tell their friends. You know, they don't really want to say out loud, you know, I feel XYZ when I'm, you know, intimate in this kind of way. So it's kind of like, well, how, you know, how do you get through that? How do you, you know, get around that when that's something that is such a subject that can make people feel so uncomfortable to talk about out loud? But realistically, you know, if they don't, it only is going to affect themselves. And then also, you know, when they are romantic with somebody.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said, you know, where do people go? Because I've spoken to people before, and they, you know, they have been to their GP about some sort of, you know, maybe if it's a man, the way that their penis is behaving or not behaving in the way that they want them to, or, you know, for a woman, it might be she isn't, you know, she's struggling to experience orgasm, and it's like, okay, so I go to the GP. The GP says everything's functioning really well. Maybe I even see, you know, a urologist, or, you know, get further checks done, and everything I'm told is fine. And then who do I go to? And, you know, the average counselor, so, you know, the person that you would go to for emotional support, a lot of them aren't trained in the nuances of sexuality. And also, if you haven't done a lot of your own exploration of your own sexuality, you will, you know, very likely feel uncomfortable talking about other people's if you haven't explored and you aren't aware of your own personal nuances of your sexuality. So then a lot of people like, where do I even go to for support? And how do I even start this journey? So it's really important to create awareness that there are specific people that can help and support around that. And, you know, the shame and this discomfort that people experience, you know, it might not necessarily be extremely clear or obvious that that's what they're experiencing, but, you know, the shame can manifest itself in, for example, a woman struggling to orgasm could potentially be, could be lots of different reasons, but it could be around shame, and it could be around a disconnect from the genitals and feeling uncomfortable, you know, looking at her own genitals. And, you know, a lot of women have never actually looked at themselves in the mirror. And especially if they have given birth, you know, the idea then of having a look at your own vulva, it can, for some women, can be quite terrifying, because they just, you know, one, they didn't know what it looked like before, and then two, seeing something and it's possibly changed and how that can feel. But bringing that awareness and really being able to fall in love with your own body, and like, you know, saying genitals and sexuality being, you know, one of the biggest places where we harbor most of our shame. Once we're able to really come to, you know, fully accept and love that part of ourselves, it just enables us in our sexuality to have a lot more confidence in how we interact with other people. Because, for example, for I'm not sure if yourself or your listeners are aware of something that's called the orgasm gap. And basically that's depending on the study that you look at, men tend to orgasm somewhere between 70 to 90% of the time with penetration, whereas with women, it's a lot less. So it's, somewhere between 30 to 50%. And it really depends on the studies that you're looking at. But anyway, there is the gap. And one of the reasons being is a lot of women aren't self-pleasuring, so they're not masturbating, so they don't know where the pleasure is or how to experience pleasure because they don't want to touch themselves. They don't know how to ask for what they want, and they don't feel confident doing so. So it's learning, how to be able to ask for that and be confident voicing it and not feeling like you're being needy or high maintenance, which is something that a lot of women experience, that when they have wants and needs that they're actually high maintenance, but that can often be somebody else's discomfort of receiving that information and how it triggers them and makes them feel. So you have all of these different elements that can be feeding into a woman's sexuality and her ability of whether or not to experience an orgasm. And then when you take a look at what men experience, men can experience a lot of shame around their genitals. There's a lot for men around, penis size. So, a lot of men can experience discomfort, especially if they are, as teenagers, a little bit behind with puberty and their penis hasn't grown to the size of the other, teenagers in the same, like locker room, for example, or, changing space for PE or whatever it might be at school. And that for men can sit with them even, when they do mature and they do reach puberty, that feeling of being, smaller or less than, it can carry through, as they get older. And a lot of men also can have this feeling of needing to perform, that sex for them is a performance and it determines sort of their sense of masculinity. So and they can feel a lot of shame for not being able to please a woman. And if they don't, please a woman, then they project that shame back on themselves, or they can project it out onto their partner and almost blame their partner in a way. And that's when you can get in relationships this sort of like disconnect between each other, when people aren't communicating and they're behaving from a wounded place, and those wounds are projecting at each other without really fully understanding what's happening internally for them, and then being able to communicate it from a vulnerable place, and then being able to listen to somebody else's vulnerable share without taking it personally, which can be also just as challenging.
The thing is everybody's different, as in I don't mean like everybody, I mean everybody, physical, the body is different. And everyone's, might work slightly differently for certain things. And it's just, just because it might have, worked with someone in the past, it is about listening to your partner in the present, because, and not getting so defensive or, feeling that it's your fault or something, or it's their fault. It's actually just, it's learning to explore each other, which I think a lot of the time, not everyone will do, because they think that they know what they're doing or they don't need to be told any differently. And I think it's really important actually with communication to be able to sit down and say, X, Y, Z, but that again, it can be, two different ways can go. There's that we were saying that, you could get quite defensive and no, I know what I'm doing. Or there's also the shame of even being someone that says, by the way, maybe you're not doing it how I like it, or you're not doing it, I wouldn't say right, but you're not doing it. So there's actually two different ways which people can struggle with.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one of the things quite often that I speak to people about, is having the conversations and how to actually approach different subjects, because we can be so caught up in our own experience and what we're making it mean about us, that actually if we take a moment to pause, the other person is actually running with a program and a story about how the situation is making them feel about themselves. And if you can, just take a moment and pause and really listen to what the other person is saying and their own wounds around something, it just gives you this opportunity for your heart to open and just really be present and listen to the other person. And it does give the opportunity to create well, it's a vulnerable share. So with vulnerabilities, automatically there's going to be intimacy, isn't there? And it does really give you that opportunity to drop further into a deeper sense of intimacy and heart opening as well. And the issue, I suppose, in inverted commas, that we have around sex is how men and women tend to approach sex differently, and that comes down a lot to the conditioning that we've received. So women haven't had the permission as much as men to be sexual. For women, it's either you're like the virgin or the whore. There's sort of like no gray area. And so it's difficult for a lot of women to be able to be sexual, because then even if you like sex and you enjoy it and you're a very sexual person, there's always this fear that you might be being used for it. So it's about being sexually empowered, in your full authentic sexual expression, but at the same time ensuring that the people that you're attracting are also, at a similar level to yourself in how they approach the sexuality. And then, for men, you've got the issue that a lot of them grow up with the conditioning that they aren't allowed to be emotional, that they need to hide their emotions, that they can't, give each other hugs, they can't be physically intimate with other human beings unless it's a partner. It's okay with their mother as a child, and then it gets to a certain age where that's no longer considered culturally as appropriate. But, men are human beings and still need that intimate connection with other human beings. They don't have permission for that. They don't have, cultural permission to be emotional. And what happens is you get a lot of men holding that in and repressing it. And it means then that, when men get older, the only access that they have really that's to physical and emotional intimacy that they are allowed, and again, in inverted commas, the allowed, is sex. So it makes sense in a way that, men will reach towards women for connection around sex, because that's where they get a lot of their physical and emotional intimacy needs met. And, when men begin to make this realization that that's, the behavior that they have and why, and they really begin to take a look at that, that's when they're able to, again, like I said before, once you become aware of it, then you get to choose to do it differently. And the choice isn't an easy one, because if you spent your whole life, being told not to give people hugs and not to be vulnerable with how you feel, it feels really difficult to start doing that. It feels really uncomfortable. There's feels like almost a warning system in your body going, no, don't do this, it's dangerous. So being able to be with that discomfort, and reach out to another human being and ask for a hug or ask to speak to them from a vulnerable position, that really does begin the journey of a deeper connection. And it's a deeper connection that both of us actually want. So us being men and women, we both actually want that. So in my work, what I have noticed is that men and women want exactly the same things. Like there's no difference. How they talk about dating, how they talk about the relationship, how they talk about not being seen in their relationship, or how they talk about not being valued. It's all exactly the same. It's just that our conditioning is different, and how we react to the other person is different, and how we, trigger each other. Those are the only differences. So if we can remember that our partner or the people that we interact with also want the same thing. So if we can bring ourselves to that sort of thought and remind ourselves that the other person wants the same thing, but they're just going about it in a way that's not necessarily healthy, it means we can have empathy. It means we can still maintain our boundaries as well, which is really important, because sometimes when I talk about empathy, people think that you just need to allow them anything to happen because they're just, operating from their own trauma. And absolutely not. Empathy doesn't mean that then you need to sort of let your boundaries go. You maintain your boundaries, but what it does is it enables a connection and an understanding for you to speak to and deal with that person, so that you're not doing it from your own triggered place, taking it personally, because their behavior is not personal to you. It is just the stuff that they've got going on in their head and their own stories.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say to somebody then that maybe wants to wants to how do I say this, they wanna be more vulnerable with their partner, and they're so worried and they're so scared, and to put themselves out there, and to be honest, whatever it is, especially when it comes to sex, and like we were saying before, they're not doing it correctly. Not, I don't mean correctly, they're not doing it how this person wants to or enjoys it, and they're worried to put themselves out there and be vulnerable. What would you say? Because I think that's really important, and like I think we were saying before, is not a lot of people, I mean, you're not going to ask your friends, how do I be vulnerable, and how do I ask my partner to XYZ?
Yeah, so I think when you make the very, very first decision to do this, already the awareness is a huge step, that you want to already be vulnerable. So the fact that you are even aware of that is already, I think, most of it. And the next thing is being really clear on what you want to say. And it's really important that when you share things, that you share them from a place of self-responsibility. So rather than saying you don't do this and you don't do that, talking about what I would like and it would feel good to me to receive. And then the other person is less likely to feel that you are criticizing them, making judgments, or picking on them in any way. So taking full responsibility for that. So how I feel, and using I statements is really, really important to that. Also, when you want to share how you're feeling, again, taking full responsibility to how I feel. So rather than saying, you don't think about me because, you don't do the dishwasher, as an example, it's always me that does it. You can say something along the lines of, it would mean a lot to me if we could come to another agreement or arrangement around the dishwasher. I'm feeling like at the moment that I'm taking a lot of the weight around the house. So it would be really great if we could come to some sort of conclusion around that. So you're not telling them what to do. You're giving them the opportunity to come with a solution, but you're also explaining how you're feeling in a way that's sort of self-responsible. Mm-hmm. And then also, as you share that, being mindful that the other person is very likely, no matter how well you say it, it's very likely that the other person could potentially be triggered by that. Why? Because they are used to how you have always dealt with situations. So if you tend to have always dealt with situations from a place of you don't do this and you don't do that, it's going to take them some time to unhear the finger pointing. So, and it can take somewhere between 3 to 6 months of you changing a pattern in yourself to the other person sort of responding to that pattern in the way that you intend for them to respond to it, if that makes sense. So for me to change how I speak to my partner, so that I'm no longer pointing the finger and I'm talking from a place of I feel, it could take them 3 months before they actually adapt to it. And gentle reminders when you're speaking to them, I'm not blaming you. I'm just explaining how I'm feeling about the situation. So being mindful that, when their triggers come up, that, one, it's because of they're used to already how you've been talking. And two, it's again that those internal stories. And, one way to create more intimacy is when that person is talking about their stories, but you don't do this and you don't do that and you don't do whatever, as they're coming back at you and being defensive, a good question is, and how does that make you feel? And, encouraging them to explore the emotions around what they're experiencing. And the reason being is we get so often stuck in stories and point scorings that we're not actually paying attention to how that makes us feel. So if you ask your partner, how does that make you feel? It just creates a moment of pause, gives time for the person to really think about it. And if they drop into a story again, which quite often a lot of people do if they're not used to talking about how something makes them feel, say to them, how does that make you feel? Angry, sad, disgusted, upset? Mm-hmm. Give some emotions and just give them a moment again to understand what that means. Like, how do I feel? Not many people get asked that. So just really giving them the space to really understand, what emotion am I feeling at that time?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the thing is, like we were saying before, people were triggered for different reasons and people have, different triggers for different things. But it's okay. And if you do share your opinion or you do get vulnerable with someone and then they are triggered and their defensive come up and, their mechanisms come out, it's not necessarily you. It's not your fault, especially if you have been vulnerable. Don't then not be vulnerable again, because they got maybe defensive and something like that, because like you were saying, it's something that's probably from the past. It is in their head, that's just that triggered them. So then it's like, okay, well then how do we get through these triggers? Because then that helps the person that maybe was slightly more defensive or triggered, balance that out. And then also the person that's been vulnerable, it can help the person that's been vulnerable also be more vulnerable in the future without the fear.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is what, where really good listening skills come in as well, because when you're able to really listen to what somebody else is saying, that's when people feel safe then to be able to speak to you. If you think about the people that you speak to and go to, and when you want to talk about something, the ones that immediately offer you advice, the ones that sort of dismiss your experience, you either find that you'll do one of two things. You'll either argue back, yeah, but it's this, and yeah, but it's that, because what your goal is in that situation is that you want to be seen and you want to be heard, and you want them to recognize what your pain is around that particular topic. So you keep arguing, hoping that they will see the pain, not necessarily your point of view regarding the story, but the pain. You want to be seen in that pain. And then, the other way that you might behave is completely shut down, because you don't feel seen and you don't feel heard in what you're saying. So the easiest way to respond to that is just completely shutting down and not continuing the conversation. And those are the two ways. So if you notice as you're speaking to somebody that it feels like they're arguing back, or it feels like they're completely shut down, then the invitation is just to take a moment. How can my response, how can my behavior, what I am saying, actually be causing that response in the other person?
Do you feel that, when people can get to that part, when they do love, who they are in that respect, it does help with being vulnerable and with being open, and maybe with, having conversations moving forward with partners?
Yeah, because, when you feel confident in yourself and who you are, you are more likely to have better boundaries. You are better at communicating what you want, because you understand what you want as well. It seems like a bit of an odd sort of comparison. But, if you go out for a meal and you don't want something, you will say to the waiter or waitress, can I have this, but not like this and not like that? Like, you feel totally comfortable, changing the dish to meet your needs, because we're allowed to do that. But we're also allowed to say how we want our bodies to be touched or not to be touched as well. I mean, even more so, so we're mindful of what we're putting in our body and how that makes us feel. But what about how we're touching, or, allowing our bodies to be touched? It's important to recognize that and to be able to voice it and communicate it. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that, again, when we are younger, we are encouraged to kiss that aunt or uncle that we don't really want to kiss. So we're being told that our body autonomy and body boundaries don't really matter, because, kiss Auntie Jane because you've not seen her since last year. So you don't want to, but you're in a way forced to. And so you end up with these patterns of behavior of allowing people to touch you in a way that you don't really want to be touched. Because that's been your whole pattern your whole life. Whereas if you can be 100% confident in how you like to be touched, where you like to be touched, then it just makes sense that it's going to be easier then for you to be able to voice that, because you know yourself. And it's also nice as well to know your boundaries about what you don't like.
I'm sure it happens a lot of the time where someone says no and the response is, oh, but you're going to really enjoy it, or, oh, please let me do it. You're going to really, you're going to love it. Or, I don't want anything in return. I want to do this for you. And you still say no, but they still say, oh, but come on, you're going to really enjoy it. I think it's really important that if you have a boundary and you knew even before the person tries to convince you that you didn't want to do it, I think it's so important to just keep saying no. And then if that person's not going to listen to you, then that's a completely different ball game. But I think it's really important that as long as you keep up your boundaries, and if you know you don't want it, it's not falling into the trap of, oh, but you're going to really enjoy it, I don't want anything in return. And then again, actually, I wanted to then ask one more thing. So, what piece of advice would you give to someone then that, they are aware, and they're learning about themselves, but they're not happy. They're not happy with they're not happy with what it looks like, maybe the size, they're just not happy. And it's quite difficult to change those things. So what would you say to someone that's really adamant that they're just not happy?
So my first question would be to understand exactly what brought them to not like themselves. So I know good practice is to actually, so there are resources on the internet where you can look at lots of different, for women, you can look at lots of different vulvas, because obviously porn tends to have this idea of like the perfect vulva, but vulvas are so very, very different. So actually going and looking at so many different vulvas, and it's like, oh my gosh, that can completely change your idea, because we don't see other people's vulvas, don't really know what they look like, we see our own, maybe not everybody does. So yeah, seeing different vulvas, and the same for men, seeing pictures of flaccid penises, because again, a lot of men, when they see penises, they tend to see them erect. So actually going and searching out those images so you can get an idea of the variety, and just like there are with faces, the variety and difference that there is with faces, there is exactly the same with genitals. And I think if you're able to be aware of that and see that and notice that, and also be aware of all the thoughts and stories that you've got, maybe somebody has said something once, or bringing presence and understanding from those two different perspectives can really begin, again, that process of learning to love yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's I mean, it makes sense, and it's learning to love yourself, and learning to be able to look in the mirror and just appreciate what is looking, what you can see looking back at you. And I think that's hugely important, and I think it really does help then moving forward with your partner or whoever you are intimate with 100%. So is there anything else that you would like to mention or talk about today?
No, I would say that's well, we could go off on loads of other different topics, but around what we've covered, yeah, that's great, Talia, thank you.
Awesome, perfect. And then I just wanted to share, then you run courses, don't you? You've got one, I mean, obviously depending on when this airs, you've got one coming out soon. So what are the courses?
So I have got the Queen of Blowjobs, an online course, and that's being launched, or was launched, on the 14th of March. And that is not so much about technique. It's more about women who would like to enjoy giving a blowjob, but maybe because of their own conditioning around their own sexuality, around genitals, they feel not very confident or a lot of discomfort. So that course is there to support women in understanding all of that conditioning, working through it, holding their shame, and finding a part of themselves that they can empower to actually really enjoy giving head. They also have men who are sharing very vulnerably their experience with blowjobs, their sexuality, and also the relationship to their genitals. So it's a real great educational resource as well for women to understand men and their fears and anxieties as well around sex and their own bodies. And then I have my normal one-to-one coaching, which is for men and women. And then I've got another course coming up in August, which is around female pleasure. So for women who don't feel comfortable touching themselves, that don't have a good relationship with their vulva, that would like to learn how to self-pleasure in a really supportive, conscious way without shame. I'll be releasing that one on the 8th of August, which is International Female Orgasm Day. So it's the 14th of March. That's when I release the Queen of Blowjobs. It's International Steak and Blowjob Day. So I thought that would be an apt time to release it. So, and all of that information can be found on my website, which is carlacrivaro.com.
Awesome. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Talia, for having me.